The forest was a cathedral of silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves underfoot and the distant caw of a crow perched on a skeletal branch. Sergeant Blake Turner's boots pressed into the damp earth, crunching leaves that had lain undisturbed for months, perhaps years, releasing the faint scent of decay and moss into the cold morning air. Every step seemed to echo louder than it should, bouncing off trees in a rhythm that reminded him too vividly of distant gunfire and the rhythmic pounding of artillery, memories he could never quite escape. Blake had been home for months, yet the silence of civilian life felt like another war, a quiet battlefield where ghosts lingered, and every shadow whispered of loss, of duty unfulfilled, of comrades lost, and names forever etched into memory. By his side, Rocco moved with purpose, a sleek, muscular German shepherd with eyes the color of molten amber, sharp and aware of everything around him. Blake had adopted Rocco from a local shelter after seeing a note describing him as hyper-alert, needs an experienced handler, which Blake immediately recognized as a polite way of saying the dog had seen too much and carried too much already. Blake had seen it in soldiers too, the memories that no one could erase, the vigilance that never turned off, the instinct that always watched for danger, even when the world seemed calm. From the moment they met, Blake and Rocco had understood each other. There was no need for words. Their bond was forged from the same raw understanding of trauma, survival, and loyalty. They moved together through the forest, a pair of warriors navigating a world that often felt indifferent, sometimes hostile, yet occasionally filled with moments of quiet grace. As they progressed deeper into the trees, Rocco suddenly froze mid-step. His entire body coiled like a spring, ears snapping erect, nose quivering, and tail rigid. Blake slowed, sensing the shift immediately. The air felt different here, heavy with a weight he couldn't explain, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. Rocco's low growl vibrated through his chest, soft but insistent, a sound that commanded attention without aggression. Blake crouched slightly, hand on Rocco's shoulder, whispering, "What is it, boy? What do you smell?" But the dog didn't respond in words. He bolted. Like a bolt of lightning, Rocco surged forward into the underbrush, breaking through thick brambles and low-hanging branches with an intensity Blake could barely match. The Marine's heart leapt into his throat. "Rocco, heel! Come back!" he shouted, crashing after him, arms and legs snagged by thorns that tore through his jacket and scraped his skin raw. He had chased dogs and suspects during training drills, but this was different. This was instinct, precision, and purpose combined in a way that no exercise could ever simulate. The forest closed around Blake, branches slapping his face, roots twisting beneath his boots, mud clinging to every crease of his uniform. And yet he pressed on, driven by something deeper than obedience, a sense that Rocco had found something they both needed to see. A trail of flattened undergrowth led them into a hidden clearing, almost perfectly circular, as if nature itself had carved out a secret space. And in the center of that clearing, partially hidden by overgrowth, lay the remnants of a burned-out vehicle. Blackened, twisted metal formed a jagged sculpture. The roof collapsed, windows melted inward, and the once shiny chrome of handles and panels now pitted and rusted beyond recognition. The smell hit Blake next, a thick, acrid scent of fire and burnt rubber, sharp and metallic, lingering like a warning. This was no ordinary wreck. Rocco skidded to a halt in front of the driver's side, paws digging into the soft, wet soil, ears flat, tail stiff. His growl had deepened into an urgent, low whine. Blake crouched, careful not to startle him, and followed the dog's gaze to the crumpled door. There was a small gap, jagged and dark, and Rocco's nose twitched as he pressed against it repeatedly. All right, I see it," Blake muttered, his voice catching in his throat. He reached forward cautiously, brushing aside rust flakes and shards of glass, and the first object emerged, a dog tag, blackened and bent from heat. Blake froze. His hands shook slightly as he wiped away the soot and debris. The tag read,
Corporal Lucas Grant, a Marine, a friend, a brother-in-arms who had vanished 3 years ago under circumstances no one could fully explain. Presumed dead, yet now, here, evidence lay in his palm. Memories cascaded through Blake's mind. Lucas's laughter on deployment, his stories about adopting a German shepherd, the way he promised to care for a dog like family. Blake looked down at Rocco, who was pressing against his arm, whining softly, tail rigid but wagging with a controlled intensity. The dog's eyes were bright, focused, unyielding, acknowledging something Blake could not yet understand fully, but trusting him to act, to follow the trail that had been uncovered. He leaned closer, flashlight slicing through the shadows inside the car, revealing twisted seatbelts, shards of melted plastic, and a collapsed roof panel. The wreck told a story of chaos, heat, and terror, but it also carried a strange precision, the remnants of a struggle, the traces of someone or something that had been here before the flames consumed the vehicle entirely. Then Blake saw it, a second tag, smaller, a pet's tag, scratched and charred but legible. Ranger. Lucas's dog. The dog he had planned to adopt. The bond he had promised to protect. Blake exhaled slowly, realizing the unimaginable. Lucas hadn't faced the fire alone. Someone, or something, had been with him, had survived, had fought, had tried to endure. And Rocco, instinctively, had known this. The dog had drawn Blake here, guiding him to the truth buried beneath decades of decay, overgrowth, and silence. Blake's heart pounded in his chest, the old adrenaline of war awakening alongside a surge of grief, awe, and determination. Rocco's golden eyes met his, unwavering, intense, alive with memory and recognition that transcended words. The clearing seemed to breathe around them. Fog curling over the wreck, mist rising from the wet soil, sunlight glinting off the wet leaves in fractured shards. Blake knelt, touching the metal of the car, the dog tags in his hand, and the dog by his side, a living sentinel. This was more than discovery. It was a calling, a mission that neither time, decay, nor death could erase. Lucas's story was buried, almost forgotten, yet Blake had been brought here, summoned by the instincts of a dog whose loyalty and intuition surpassed human comprehension. He whispered to Rocco, voice low, reverent, "You brought me here, boy. You knew where to find him." Rocco exhaled softly, pressing his head against Blake's arm, and for the first time in years, Blake felt a connection that could bridge oceans of grief, months of absence, and decades of uncertainty. This was not just a dog leading a Marine. It was the start of uncovering a story that would demand answers, honor, and justice. Blake took a shaky breath, letting the damp forest air fill his lungs, and turned his attention fully to the burned-out car. The vehicle had been consumed by fire long ago, yet every twisted panel, every blackened edge seemed to whisper a story. The acrid scent of charred metal and scorched rubber clung to the clearing, as if the fire itself had etched its memory into the very air. Rocco prowled along the perimeter, paws crunching in the wet leaves, nose close to the ground, ears constantly pivoting like twin radars. The dog's growls and low whines resonated with the forest, as though it too acknowledged that this place was sacred ground, a place where the remnants of a life, a struggle, and a bond refused to be forgotten. Blake crouched near the driver's side, flashlight in hand, shining its beam through the collapsed window frame. Shadows danced across the twisted interior, highlighting melted seatbelts, burned upholstery, and charred fragments of a dashboard. It was hard to imagine that anyone had survived the inferno, yet the presence of Lucas's dog tag and the smaller pet tag proved that something extraordinary had occurred. Rocco pawed insistently at the driver's side, whining as he pressed his nose into the rusted gap, nudging Blake forward, urging him to see what had been hidden for years. Blake leaned in carefully, brushing aside debris, and uncovered another glint of metal. Another dog tag? No, this one was smaller, blackened, almost hidden beneath ashes. He picked it up, turning it in his gloved hands. Ranger. the pet Lucas had promised to adopt.
Blake's throat tightened as he realized the magnitude of what the dog had led him to. Lucas hadn't been entirely alone.
The realization sent a chill through Blake, deeper than the damp air or the mud clinging to his boots. Someone or something had been here with Lucas before or during the fire. The metal scraps and melted glass weren't the whole story. There were traces of movement, of struggle, of a fight against fate itself. Blake knelt and examined the surrounding ground. Deep paw prints embedded in soft mud and scorched earth hinted at a companion.
Rocco circled the wreck, tracing the edge of the clearing, as if confirming the evidence Blake had just observed. The dog's precision and focus were uncanny. Every paw placement, every sniff, every shift in posture spoke of a memory, a warning, a signal that Blake couldn't ignore. Blake's fingers trembled slightly as he reached into the wreckage again. Under a warped piece of the roof, he uncovered remnants of personal items. Glasses melted at the edges, a phone case warped beyond recognition, and fragments of clothing blackened with soot. But there was something else. A corner of a camouflage sleeve, barely intact, peeked from beneath a collapsed section of the driver's seat. Blake carefully pulled it free, revealing the faint embroidery of Lucas's name. His pulse raced as he realized this was more than debris. It was a trace of life, a fragment of struggle that had survived fire and time. Rocco pressed closer, nudging Blake's hand with his nose, as though acknowledging the importance of the discovery. The dog's eyes met Blake's, filled with a clarity and intensity that felt almost human. He could sense the story Lucas had endured, the battle for survival that remained untold. Blake moved around the car, scanning the ground, noting disturbed patches of dirt that didn't belong to the natural flow of the forest. Small depressions indicated movement after the fire, perhaps an attempt to move items or survive. Blake's mind raced. Lucas had not simply been a victim of the blaze. He had fought, struggled, tried to escape, and perhaps he had been helped, if only momentarily, by another presence. The thought weighed heavily, a combination of hope and dread pressing against Blake's chest. He reached for the tags again, turning them over and over, imagining Lucas holding them, imagining Ranger close by, sensing danger even then. The dog had survived, and somehow Rocco had known. Blake stepped back, taking in the full scope of the wreckage. The sunlight filtered through the forest canopy, casting shifting shadows across the twisted frame. Every detail, the charred metal, the melted glass, the tiny fragments of life, seemed to pulse with memory. He realized that the fire had not erased Lucas, it had only hidden him, obscured the story, waiting for someone perceptive enough to follow the trail. And Rocco, with instincts honed sharper than any human's, had done just that. He had sensed a truth buried beneath the ash, beneath the silence, and guided Blake directly to it. Blake's thoughts turned to Lucas's family. They deserved answers. They had waited, hoping against hope, and yet had been met only with uncertainty. Blake clenched his jaw, a surge of resolve coursing through him. This was no longer a discovery, it was a mission. Every charred fragment, every clue Rocco had led him to was evidence. Evidence of survival, evidence of struggle, evidence of loyalty that had refused to fade. Ranger had survived the initial chaos, somehow enduring the aftermath, and the dog's instincts had ensured that the truth would eventually come to light. Rocco whined softly, stepping closer, pressing his forehead against Blake's chest. The gesture was simple, yet profound, a silent communication that connected the Marine to the dog, to Lucas, and to the story hidden in the wreckage. Blake swallowed hard, nodding slowly. "We're not leaving, boy, not until we know everything." Rocco's tail gave a faint, deliberate wag, a signal of understanding, acknowledgement, and readiness. Together, they surveyed the wreck and the surrounding clearing. The forest seemed to hold its breath with them, waiting, watching. Blake's eyes caught movement further into the clearing, a faint indentation in the soil, partially hidden by fallen leaves and ash.
He knelt, brushing it away, revealing a trail leading away from the wreck. It was subtle but deliberate, depressions that could only have been made by someone or something moving carefully through the undergrowth. He traced it with his eyes, feeling a mixture of apprehension and hope.
Lucas's story didn't end here. The journey had continued, hidden, obscured, but not erased. The truth waited, and Blake now had the key.
Rocco barked sharply, a single clear note that cut through the silence, commanding attention. Blake followed the dog's gaze to the faint path, understanding immediately that Rocco had sensed something beyond the wreck itself, something living, something that had been here before, and perhaps something that still remained nearby. The forest felt alive now, every rustle and whisper filled with meaning.
Blake exhaled slowly, gripping the dog tags tightly in his hand, the weight of responsibility settling over him. He would find answers. He would uncover the full story. And Rocco, with instincts sharper than any human's, would lead him there. The Marine rose to his feet, boots sinking slightly into the soft earth, and looked down at Rocco. The shepherd's amber eyes were steady, unwavering, filled with intelligence, loyalty, and something that resembled understanding. Blake reached down, pressing a hand against the dog's head, and whispered, "We found the beginning. Now we finish it." Rocco exhaled softly, tail brushing against Blake's leg. Together, they stepped forward, ready to follow the trail that would reveal the truth hidden in the burned forest, a truth only they could uncover.
The forest around the burned-out car seemed to shift subtly as Blake and Rocco moved through it. Sunlight filtered in fractured beams through the thick canopy, casting elongated shadows that stretched across the twisted remains like dark fingers reaching out from the past. Blake's heart pounded, each beat echoing in his ears louder than the rustle of leaves or the distant call of birds. The tags in his hand felt heavier than metal should, as though they carried not only the weight of Lucas's absence, but the weight of his struggle, his survival, and the untold story that had remained hidden for years. He glanced down at Rocco, whose amber eyes flicked between the wreck and the surrounding forest, tail low but tense, body coiled like a spring ready to pounce. Blake understood instinctively the dog was signaling more than curiosity. He was signaling the continuation of a journey they had just begun. Blake crouched again beside the wreck, fingertips brushing charred metal, melted glass, and twisted wires. Each fragment seemed to whisper secrets, stories of a life interrupted, of a man forced into a fight he hadn't anticipated. There were tiny signs he had missed the first time, scorch marks that suggested someone had tried to break into the car, scratches along the roof that indicated struggle, and faint impressions in the ash where someone or something had attempted to lift debris or move through the wreck. Blake exhaled slowly, the air thick in his lungs. Lucas hadn't merely perished in the fire. He had fought, clawed, and perhaps even escaped before the flames fully consumed his vehicle. Rocco whined softly, nudging Blake's arm, then moved to the rear of the car, sniffing along the edge of a collapsed fender. Blake followed, shining his flashlight across the forest floor. Faint depressions appeared, subtle, half buried by leaves and ash, indicating movement away from the car. Someone had been here, post-fire. Perhaps a rescuer, perhaps someone involved in the tragedy, perhaps Lucas himself. Blake's mind raced, sorting through possibilities, but the forest offered no answers, only fragments, clues, and the unrelenting weight of uncertainty. Rocco barked softly, single, precise, as if directing Blake's attention to a spot partially hidden beneath fallen leaves. Blake knelt carefully, brushing away the debris. His fingers touched something soft. Cloth burned along the edges, but still intact enough to recognize a pattern. Camouflage, Lucas's pattern. The sleeve had been torn, charred at the seams, but the embroidery of his name remained faintly visible. Blake felt his chest tighten, a surge of grief, rage, and determination coursing through him. He realized that this was not merely an accident or a forgotten crash.
There had been effort, struggle, and survival here. Someone had tried to move, to hide, or to escape. Perhaps Lucas had fought for his life. Perhaps he had been assisted by someone, maybe even Ranger. The dog tag had hinted at it, and now the sleeve confirmed it. This was a trail of survival, a breadcrumb path through ash and shadow that demanded to be followed. Blake's eyes scanned the clearing more carefully this time. There were indentations in the soil near the car, subtle but deliberate. Human footprints? Possibly. Heavy, precise steps leading away, then curving into the dense brush. Rocco pressed forward, nose to the ground, ears twitching, following the faint path with unwavering focus. Blake's hands tightened on his flashlight. He had trained in some of the most brutal conditions imaginable, had followed leads in deserts and war zones where death lurked behind every shadow. But this was personal. This was a brother, a friend, and a story that had been stolen from the world for too long. And the guide at his side, Rocco, had led him to the truth. As they moved deeper into the forest, Blake felt the air change. The scent of ash and burnt metal lingered, but beneath it there was another note, subtler, almost imperceptible, the faint smell of damp fur and earth displaced by movement. Rocco's paws sank into soft soil, pressing into hidden depressions, as if signaling the presence of someone else who had walked here after the fire. Blake followed each step meticulously, careful not to disturb the subtle traces. Every moment heightened his awareness. Every snap of a twig sounded louder. Every whisper of wind against leaves carried weight. He realized the forest itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for him to uncover the story hidden beneath its floor, beneath the silence that had lasted for years. They arrived at a small rise in the clearing, almost imperceptible, where the earth seemed slightly disturbed, sunken yet firm. Blake knelt, brushing aside leaves and ash, revealing a small indentation that could only have been made intentionally. It wasn't deep enough for a body, but it suggested someone had knelt here, struggled, perhaps placed something down. Blake's pulse raced. Could Lucas have tried to retrieve Ranger? Could he have been fighting to save his companion before the fire? The questions weighed on Blake heavily, but there were no immediate answers, only clues. Rocco's gaze stayed fixed on the indentation, ears rotating as though listening for echoes Blake could not hear. Blake's chest tightened with emotion. The mixture of grief, awe, and determination was almost overwhelming. Lucas had survived the fire, or at least part of it, and his story had been waiting, buried beneath charred metal and forest growth. Ranger had survived too, and Blake knew instinctively that the dog had been integral in guiding someone, perhaps even Lucas himself, through those final desperate moments. Rocco's amber eyes met Blake's, steady, unwavering, intelligent, as if communicating, "We must keep going. The story does not end here." Blake nodded, swallowing hard, and pressed on, following the subtle signs, the depressions, the broken twigs, and the trail that would eventually unravel the truth. The sun dipped lower, shadows stretching, light glinting off small shards of metal scattered across the clearing. Blake realized the significance of every small detail, every mark, every piece of evidence. Each one told a fragment of Lucas's struggle, of his survival, of the companionship that had endured beyond the fire. Rocco nudged Blake again, soft but insistent, guiding him back toward the wreck and then toward the faint, twisting trail that led into the deeper forest. Blake exhaled slowly, gripping the dog tags tightly, and whispered, "We're going to find the rest, I promise." Rocco barked softly, a single clear note, affirming their shared purpose. Together, Marine and Shepherd moved forward, deeper into the forest, ready to uncover the truth hidden for years, each step carrying the weight of loyalty, devotion, and justice long overdue. The forest seemed almost alive as Blake and Rocco pushed further, every step revealing subtle changes in the undergrowth, every rustle and whisper of leaves carrying meaning. The morning's fog had lifted, replaced by an uneasy calm that seemed too deliberate to be natural. Blake's boots sank into patches of soft soil,
disturbed in ways that suggested the movement of someone or something through the dense brush. He squinted, eyes scanning for the faintest sign of Lucas or Ranger, knowing instinctively that every broken twig, every indentation in the earth was a fragment of a story that had gone untold for years. Rocco moved with precision, circling ahead, then doubling back to press his nose into the dirt, guiding Blake as if he were the human partner in a well-coordinated mission. Blake followed carefully, mindful of the forest floor, and gradually a second clearing emerged, smaller and more hidden than the first. Sunlight barely penetrated the thick canopy above, creating shadows that flickered and shifted like living specters. The ground was littered with leaves, ash, and tiny shards of metal, some glinting faintly in the sparse light. And there, half buried beneath the debris, something metallic caught Blake's eye. He crouched and brushed away dirt and ash to reveal a small folding knife. Its blade bent and rusted, its handle engraved with initials he instantly recognized: L.G., Lucas Grant. A chill ran down his spine. The knife had clearly been used, its bent form telling a story of struggle, of desperate attempts to survive, of fights fought quietly and alone. Rocco barked sharply, a single note that cut through the stillness, and then pressed his nose to a series of shallow indentations leading away from the knife. Blake followed, shining his flashlight and carefully brushing aside leaves to reveal more subtle signs of passage. Footprints, partially concealed by detritus and mud, led deeper into the forest. Some were human, heavy and deliberate. Others were smaller, lighter, perhaps rangers, perhaps another companion. Blake's mind raced. The forest had been silent for years, keeping its secrets buried beneath leaves and shadows, and now it was revealing them piece by piece. Lucas hadn't just vanished, he had survived for some time, struggling, moving, hiding, and possibly fighting to protect someone, perhaps his dog, perhaps himself. As Blake and Rocco advanced, the forest became denser, trees leaning in as though listening to their passage. The scent of ash lingered, faint but persistent, mixing with the earthy smell of wet soil and foliage. Rocco's movements grew more urgent, his tail stiff, ears forward, nose pressed constantly to the ground. He stopped suddenly at a slight rise in the terrain, a mound partially obscured by fallen branches. Blake knelt to inspect it, brushing aside leaves to reveal a small indentation in the soil. It wasn't deep, not large enough for a body, but it bore signs of deliberate action. Someone had knelt here, struggled, and possibly hidden something. Evidence, supplies, a trace of survival. Blake's pulse quickened. Each new discovery added layers to the story he had begun to uncover, transforming the forest from a silent graveyard into a living map of events that had transpired long ago. He rose slowly, scanning the area. Small artifacts were scattered here and there: a melted strap from a backpack, a fragment of scorched clothing, a piece of metal that might have been part of a car's interior. Each piece felt heavy with meaning. The forest had preserved these remnants with a cruel precision, hiding them from the world, but keeping them intact enough for someone perceptive to find. Blake realized with growing clarity that Lucas had not simply disappeared or died. He had been part of a chain of events that had unfolded in this very clearing, in these woods, and every small clue brought him closer to understanding the truth. Rocco nudged Blake again, insistent, and then led him toward a denser patch of undergrowth, barely a path at all, where the footprints became more defined. The Marine's heart pounded as he followed, aware of every sound, every shadow, every subtle shift in the forest's rhythm. The wind whispered through the leaves in an almost sentient manner, carrying hints of smoke and metal. Blake's mind played through every possibility. Lucas had survived, Ranger had survived, but how? For how long? And who, if anyone, had helped or hindered their escape? The questions were suffocating, yet each clue seemed to answer some part of them, forming a puzzle that demanded patience, focus, and vigilance. Rocco moved with a steady, deliberate grace, unerring in his instincts,
and Blake began to rely not only on his own senses, but on the dog's. Finally, they arrived at a small, hidden rise beyond which the terrain sloped gently downward. Here, the soil was disturbed, darker, moister, and the faint smell of charred fur lingered. Blake knelt carefully, brushing away debris, revealing a series of impressions, paw prints, small but distinct, leading toward a denser section of forest. It was clear that Ranger had been here, following Lucas, possibly waiting, watching, surviving alongside him. Blake's chest tightened, a mix of relief and sorrow flooding through him. The story that had been lost in ashes, fire, and silence was emerging. Guided by instinct and loyalty, the bond between man and dog alive even after years of absence. Rocco barked again, sharper this time, signaling Blake to follow a faint trail into a thicket of brambles and fallen branches. Blake hesitated for a moment, taking in the weight of what they had discovered so far. He knew that what lay ahead might provide the answers he had been searching for all these years. The forest had concealed them, but it had also preserved them, waiting for the right pair to uncover the truth. As Blake rose, brushing leaves from his jacket, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Lucas's story was not yet complete, and he and Rocco had been chosen to carry it forward. Together, Marine and Shepherd pressed on, deeper into the forest, moving with quiet determination, following the faint impressions of paw and boot alike. The sun dipped lower in the sky, shadows stretching long and distorted across the forest floor. Each step felt heavy with expectation, yet light with possibility. The forest, once silent, now seemed alive with the memories of what had transpired, whispering secrets only perceptive eyes and ears could interpret. Blake tightened his grip on the dog tags in his hand, glanced down at Rocco's unwavering form, and whispered, "We'll find him, Ranger, and you. We'll see this through." Rocco pressed his head against Blake's hand, affirming the unspoken vow. Together they advanced into the dense woods, the burned clearing fading behind them, leaving only traces of ash, char, and the beginning of a story that would finally reach its conclusion. The forest grew quieter as Blake and Rocco advanced, but it was no longer empty. It hummed with history and memory, filled with the remnants of struggles long past and lives that had left their mark on the earth. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves seemed to carry a weight, a significance that only Blake and Rocco could interpret. The burned-out car had been the first revelation, but the forest itself was the storybook, and they were now turning its pages carefully, tracing each footprint, each paw print, each fragment of metal or fabric that had resisted decay. The sun had dipped low, casting elongated shadows that painted the clearing in gold and crimson, making the charred metal glint like embers left behind from a fire that refused to die. Blake felt the weight of responsibility settle deeper onto his shoulders. The dog tags, Ranger's tag, Lucas's tag, they were not merely artifacts. They were evidence, symbols of a story interrupted, lives intertwined, bonds of loyalty tested by fire and fear. He clutched them tightly, the cold metal pressing into his palm, grounding him. Beside him, Rocco moved with precision, ears twitching, eyes flicking between ground and canopy as if reading the invisible map of events. The dog had led him to the wreck, to the knife, to the faint trail of survival. And now, Blake realized, Rocco was guiding him to the final pieces of a puzzle that had been buried for far too long. They reached the edge of a narrow ravine, the terrain dropping sharply, roots twisting like ancient veins across the slope. Rocco stopped at the top, pressing back against Blake's leg as if signaling caution. Blake studied the area, the way the earth had been disturbed, the subtle depressions that indicated someone had been there recently relative to the wreck, moving cautiously, carrying something, or someone, in a desperate attempt to survive. His mind replayed scenarios over and over, Lucas escaping the fire, Ranger at his side, struggling through the brush, every movement calculated, every breath measured. And now, years later, Blake and Rocco were stepping into the space where those final acts had been performed, ready to uncover truths that had been obscured by time, fire and silence.
Blake carefully descended the slope, hands gripping roots and rocks for balance. Rocco stayed close, tail low but muscles taut, moving with the grace and agility only a dog accustomed to danger could maintain. The forest seemed denser here, older, as if the canopy itself had grown to shield secrets that no human eye had been meant to see. The smell of burnt wood mingled faintly with wet earth, a subtle reminder of the devastation that had begun the journey, and Blake's pulse quickened. Every step brought him closer to understanding, closer to the resolution he had been seeking since the day Lucas vanished. At the base of the ravine, Blake noticed a small depression partially hidden by fallen branches and moss. He knelt, brushing away debris, revealing the faint outline of a makeshift shelter. Burnt sticks arranged carefully, remnants of a tent or covering, and traces of a fire pit that had been used in desperate survival. The placement of items, the arrangement, the care, it all spoke of someone fighting to endure, someone clinging to life with tenacity and hope.
And then he saw it, a patch of fur, darkened by ash and dampened by dew, unmistakably canine. Ranger. The dog had survived. Blake's throat tightened, his heart threatening to burst. All those years, the dog had endured, guided perhaps by instinct, perhaps by hope, and now stood as a living testament to Lucas's fight. Rocco barked once, sharply, then nudged Blake's hand toward the shelter. Blake followed, and there, beneath the remnants of leaves and branches, he uncovered another fragment of Lucas's gear, a wallet, partially intact, soaked but preserved. He opened it carefully, revealing identification, a faded photograph of Lucas with Ranger, smiling in a moment of peace that seemed impossibly distant now. Blake's breath caught. The pieces were finally converging. Lucas had survived the fire, had endured the forest, and Ranger had been his companion through it all. The truth had been hidden not by negligence, but by circumstance, by survival instinct, by a world that had moved on, while they remained trapped in time and memory. Blake knelt beside Rocco, pressing his hand to the dog's head, feeling the steady pulse of life beneath the fur. "We found him, Ranger. We'll bring it home. We'll tell everyone what happened." Rocco leaned into him, eyes unwavering, tail wagging faintly, as though affirming the vow. The forest around them seemed to exhale, the wind whispering through the leaves in soft approval. Blake felt a surge of determination he hadn't known since his deployments, a clarity of purpose, a sense of duty renewed, not by orders, but by loyalty, by love, and by the bond between man and dog. He gathered Ranger carefully, rushing ash from the dog's fur, and fastened his own jacket around the small frame to shield him from the cold. Together, the three of them, Blake, Rocco, and Ranger, began the climb back toward the trail, the weight of years lifted slightly by the presence of life that had survived against all odds. Every step was measured, careful, yet filled with quiet triumph. Blake felt the stories of the past converging with the present, and in that moment, he understood the full depth of the journey, survival, loyalty, and the unbreakable bond between a Marine and the dogs who had guided him, protected him, and never abandoned him. As the sun dipped further, casting long shadows that danced across the forest floor, Blake glanced back at the burned clearing, the twisted metal of the car, and the silent testimony of the forest. He realized this was not just a discovery, it was a reckoning, a bridge between past and present, a story of endurance and devotion that demanded to be shared. With Rocco at his side and Ranger in his arms, Blake felt a sense of closure mingled with hope, a recognition that even in the deepest shadow, life and loyalty could endure. The forest had revealed its secrets, and they had listened, acted, and survived. Together, they would honor the story, carry it forward, and ensure that Lucas's struggle, Ranger's endurance, and the extraordinary bond that had led them through fire, ash, and silence would never be forgotten. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in years, Blake felt a flicker of peace. The weight of uncertainty lifted slightly, replaced by purpose and determination. He whispered to Rocco and Ranger, voices steady despite the tremor in his chest, "We found the truth,
And now we make sure it's never lost again. The dogs pressed closer, sharing his warmth, their presence a reminder that loyalty and courage could bridge even the darkest of times.
Together, they stepped forward, leaving the burned clearing behind, ready to face whatever lay ahead, bound by bonds that fire, loss, and time could never sever.